religion, and American nationalism.
Hello, welcome to Liberation Library. I'm Carl McRoy, and I'm joined here by Dr. Douglas Morgan of Washington Adventist University. He is a history professor and an author and an activist in his own way. And we're going to get to know him a little bit more as we get to know more about this book that he has to share with us as well. Dr. Morgan, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Glad to be with you.
Good, good. Before we jump into your title, which, well, let's go ahead and get the title out there, but we want to hear something about the historian before we go into the history book. So what are you going to be sharing with us today?
This book is entitled Reforging the White Republic, Race, Religion, and American Nationalism, 1865 to 1898. It's by Edward Blum.
Edward Blum. Very good. Good. So now, Dr. Morgan, what inspired you to become a historian?
I honestly think that it was what came easiest to me in school, and I just enjoyed it and ended up going that direction.
Now, some people think, what's so important about history? It's just a bunch of old stuff. What does it have to do with today? I mean, so
Yeah.
How does a history professor take a question like that?
I think the best thing I can think of is there's a quote from James Baldwin that I really love, because he says that history, I'm paraphrasing, but history is not simply or even primarily about the past. Rather, on the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We're unconsciously controlled by it. It's literally present in everything that we do. And he goes on to talk about how it frames our identities, gives us a frame of reference and so forth. So I think that says it about as well as anything can. It's literally present with us in all that we do. And if we are ignorant of it, I'm adding on, now this is not Baldwin, this is my commentary. So if we're ignorant of that, then we're just at the mercy of something that does influence us. But as we learn about it and are able to analyze it intelligently, that gives us some choice, some agency as to what we do with that influence.
Now, some people would say that the only thing we learn from history, well, some say that we don't really learn from history and that we're just doomed to repeat it.
I think that's the more true, the more ignorance there is. In other words, I don't see that as a law of history that cannot be resisted. Certainly, certain patterns recur, and after all, we are human beings all the way through. But I think that the study of history can change things.
Yeah, when you mentioned ignorance, it reminded me of when I visited Tuskegee and I saw a famous statue that they have there of Booker T. Washington raising up this veil. It was the veil of ignorance. And, that's what this is all about with Liberation Library, is that when we become cognizant of the things going on around us, we are liberated. We're, as Bob Marley said, we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. And so I want to thank you for those insights. Now, one of the things I find intriguing about your work, and again, I think this will lead us into the book that you reviewed, but you've written some books dealing with African American history. And given that you're not African American, what kind of gave you that interest?
Well, I think one thing I would say is that I'm a child of my times. I was I grew up in the 60s. I mean, I was still in my early teens when the 60s ended. So I wasn't really a direct participant in the events of the 60s, but I was very much shaped by the two great issues of war and race. And I also was the son of a pastor and deeply oriented toward the church. So how all of those three interrelate just sort of became my interest. And I think one way or another is really pretty much framed just about everything I've done as a historian since then. That's not the full answer, but that's a good bit of it right there.
Okay, good. Well, now let's jump into your book, and I think people will understand the reason for asking you the question about your particular area of study, because you have an intriguing title to bring to us today. So break down that title, because it's loaded.
Yes. Well, the post-Civil War period is really tumultuous and fluid and fascinating, but it goes on the one hand from this period of Reconstruction, in which, as Eric Foner says, this is the first experiment in interracial democracy in world history. And there are some advances, amazing advances on paper for civil rights and equality, constitutional amendments, and so forth. And for a short time, there are states at which all citizens, black and white, are voting. But then you have withdrawal of the federal government from enforcing those rights after 1877. And then you have this transition into codification of segregation and white supremacy in the South. And that historical pattern is something I'm familiar with, but what this book really brings out is the way in which religion played a role in all of that, especially Protestant Christianity. And it's really not so much about the most virulent forms of, Klan white racist ideology, but more of ways in which people who you could say were moderates, they had been against slavery, and they were admirable reformers in their own way, but they came to value the reunification of the nation on terms favorable to the South as more important than racial equality. So that's the reforging of the white republic, because whiteness and nationalism are linked in to a new civil order, but also one in which this civic religious justification is present. There's a quote that I really think nails it. He writes that by the end of the century, that is the end of the 19th century, most white Protestants not only accepted racial segregation and disenfranchisement, but also sanctified them as part of God's divine order for the nation. Racial justice had been crucified on the altar of white reunion. So again, these are people who would not think of themselves as racist or even prejudiced necessarily, but they sacrificed racial justice on the altar of white reunion. And in that, he says that was a return of bringing in an ethnic element to the national identity. Whereas for that brief period in Reconstruction, it had been civic values on a non-racial basis that had prevailed for a time.
All right. So I like something that you just said in the last, you mentioned Reconstruction, and then of course in the title of the book, it says Reforging. And so we have two repetitions going on here.
Yes.
So Reconstruction, just what do you think about that word? I'll share when I think about the word Reconstruction as you're talking about here, During the Reconstruction, they're trying to reconstruct a society that wasn't constructed right in the first place. That's
Okay.
what comes to mind as we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
And when we talk about reforging the White Republic, the nation was born as a white republic. It had a little interruption with that during the brief era of Reconstruction.
Right.
And now we're reforging. We're going to remake it into what we had in the first place. Is that all right
that's
for a lay
reform.
historian, for a
No, absolutely.
part-time student historian?
Absolutely, because what you bring in is actually very essential. The reforging does then refer back to the pre-Civil War or antebellum period in which slavery existed, and it was sort of democracy defined by whiteness very much prevailed. Voting rights for people of African descent in the North were highly limited. So that was the White Republic. But Blum argues, and this is somewhat controversial, there's a debate anyway among historians, exactly how meaningful was Reconstruction. But he argues, and I tend to agree, that something really remarkable did happen in that brief period. Some possibilities were opened up, but it didn't last. And so the reforging.
Right. So let's come back to, I think we all get the thing about the race and we kind of understand nationalism. Maybe you can take us deeper into that, but let's get to that main R here, religion. What was religion's role exactly? I mean, I like the language of when you said that they sacrificed, race relations at the altar of just the reunion of whiteness. So, but what were some of the specific ways that religion played a role?
Yeah, paradoxically enough, it was that wonderful thing called forgiveness. Henry Ward Beecher, one of the greatest preachers in American history, is an example. Another one, Dwight L. Moody. And they preach forgiveness of the white South. Without, I would say, really coming to terms with what had to be forgiven. In other words, it was a forgiveness that papered over, glossed over some deeply rooted, deeply structured evil, and then gave quite a bit of scope then for the forgiven person to shape things without too much change, fundamental change. Anyway, at least certainly in terms of priorities, what was more important? Let's reunify, and it's the white again. The whiteness comes in.
Reconciliation without the truth. I mean, making a reference to South Africa. Yeah, truth and reconciliation.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's well put. That nails it.
So
I think that's one of the.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I really think that is one of the key dynamics that Blum brings out. Another one briefly might be for someone like Moody. It is the individual soul is all that matters. Now, in fact, if some people have studied his career carefully, and it's really actually rather hard to escape your message having some kind of political impact, even if it's simply blessing the status quo. But Moody's desire to focus on simply the individual gospel and not have religion be something that challenges the status quo and would raise issues, complicated, unpleasant, difficult issues about race that gets downplayed in the interest of prioritizing another wonderful value. Forgiveness, great. Winning souls, great, fantastic. But in a way that is, shall we say, superficial, or at least fails to deal with the truth, as you put it so well.
Okay, so let's get to the nationalism part of the title. And we hear a lot about nationalism, and there are a lot of people, if you listen to the radio, watch some newscasts, whether syndicated or more of an independent nature, that defend nationalism. They talk about it as a good thing. What's wrong with nationalism? There's kind of an implication that from the title that this nationalism that was being reforged is not a good thing. Yeah.
Right.
So what is nationalism at its essence, and what are we supposed to understand about that?
Well, that might be a good opportunity to talk about what Blum likes to see and it favors, and that is what he calls civic nationalism, as opposed to ethnic nationalism. So nationalism, in his view, is not necessarily an evil thing, but it needs to be on the basis of civic principles, the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and so forth, rather than have the racial element in it, where one race is favored over the other. Which I think is an important distinction to make, and it has its value. I think from a Christian standpoint, though, and this is maybe where I would want to dialogue with Blum a little bit, and that is, do we really want to be mixing our religious faith and identity and our highest commitments with the nation state at all, even on the so-called good basis of civic nationalism? It's complicated, and there's some sense in which we want to, I would say, that's something that needs to be embraced. But when the ism becomes the highest loyalty, or even mixed in with the highest loyalty, I think we may have some problems.
All right. So what makes this book so liberating to you, as a historian, or just as a Christian? You know, what does this free your mind of, or how does it help you to expand your thinking, either of that era or where we are right now?
I think it delineates the way in which generally well-intentioned and highly laudable people, again, we mentioned Moody and Beecher, another would be Francis Willard. He really breaks down clearly, and we've tried to give an example or two in our discussion, of how that unintentional but yet a prioritization of things in a certain way that actually feeds in with and enables a racial racist element to come to the fore. Sometimes that's a little bit vague. We're pretty sure it's there, but it's a little difficult to trace sometimes. But I think that he just really very starkly, very clearly lays that out, and how faith, Protestant Christian faith, unfortunately, can play into that in an almost unwitting way.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Morgan. One day we're going to bring you back. We're going to explore a couple of the titles that you have put together. You have some provocative writing of your own, and it will expand our thinking of things. Any parting words that you want to share with us?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I think it's a great thing, and Yeah, it'll be fun to talk to you anytime.
All right. God bless.